Nobody in the financial world moved when Isabella Hayes walked into a room. The silence she commanded was not respect. It was fear. So when Victor Langford, drunk on imported scotch and wounded pride, raised his glass and laughed, $1 million to anyone who kisses her right now, the room laughed with him. Nobody moved. Not one person in that glittering crowd of wealth and ambition dared take a single step until a broke, humiliated black server set down his tray, straightened his collar, and walked straight toward her. When he kissed her, the laughter died. The uniform never fit right. Daniel Carter had learned to live with that. The slight pinch at the collar, the sleeves that hung an inch too long, the way the cheap polyester fabric made him sweat under the chandeliers of places he was never meant to belong. He stood in front of the narrow mirror in the staff changing room at the Hargrove Grand Hotel, adjusting his clip-on bow tie for the third time, and tried not to think too hard about the reflection staring back at him. 38 years old, a father. A man who used to write code that ran on satellites. Now he carried trays. He was the only black man on the serving staff tonight. That was not new, but it was always the first thing he noticed every time he stepped into a room full of wealthy white faces, the way a swimmer notices the temperature of water before anything else. Not a shock anymore. Just a fact that settled into the body and stayed there. He told himself it did not matter. That dignity was not measured by what you held in your hands, but by the reason you were holding it. And his reason was tucked into his front shirt pocket, a folded piece of paper, worn and soft from handling, with a 7-year-old's name typed at the top. Lily Carter. Specialist consultation. Estimated cost, $4,200. Not catastrophic, not terminal, but urgent and real, and entirely beyond what his current bank account could absorb. Daniel had been a systems engineer for nearly a decade. Good at it. The kind of good that gets you quietly offered positions you have not applied for. His firm, a mid-size infrastructure consultancy called Bridgepoint Systems, had been building something worth building. Then a larger conglomerate had circled, made an offer that looked generous on paper, and within 8 months of the acquisition, the entire technical division had been restructured out of existence. 43 people gone. Bridgepoint's name erased from the building by the following spring. That had been 3 years ago. He had tried freelance work, contract positions, anything that used his actual skills. But the market had shifted, references had scattered, and his ex-wife had left the country with someone else's future, leaving him the sole caretaker of a little girl who deserved more than she was getting. There was also something else his resume could never articulate. In an industry already lacking in diversity, a black engineer who lost his position at 35 did not enjoy the same safety net as his white colleagues. Nobody said it outright, but every interview ended the same way, polite, impressed, and never followed by a callback. He was not bitter. That was the thing people never quite believed when they looked at him. He was not angry at the world. He was just tired in the specific way that responsible men get tired, when the gap between what they can do and what they are being allowed to do becomes impossible to ignore. He picked up the serving tray. He set his jaw. Tonight was a high-profile investment gala in the grand ballroom. 6 hours, tips if he was lucky, and then home to Lily, who had asked him to read one more chapter before the lights went out. He could do that. He walked out of the changing room and into the noise. The grand ballroom was already filling, the air heavy with perfume and confidence, and the particular hum of money, talking to money. He moved along the edges of it the way he always did, present but peripheral, visible but unseen. Isabella Hayes arrived at the Hargrove Grand 20 minutes before the reception began, which was 10 minutes after her assistant had sent the third reminder, and 17 minutes after she had already reviewed the contract terms for the 4th time on her phone in the back of the car. She did not rush. She never rushed. The lobby reorganized itself when she entered. Not dramatically. Not the way people clear a path for someone dangerous, but in the subtle way that rooms adjust around a gravitational center. Isabella was 34 years old and ran a capital investment group worth a shade over $2 billion. And she moved through spaces like someone who had spent a very long time making herself impossible to surprise. Her assistant, Marcus, fell into step beside her with a briefing folder she did not open. She already knew the contents. The evening was built around a single objective, a signed agreement for a $100 million infrastructure partnership with Caldwell Ventures. Everything else, the champagne, the string quartet, the architectural lighting, was scenery. Victor Langford will be attending, Marcus said carefully. I know, Isabella said. She did not change her pace. Victor Langford had been positioning himself as a potential partner in the Hayes Group for nearly 2 years. She had declined his proposals twice, once in writing, once in a meeting where she had let the silence do the work. He was wealthy in the way that men who inherit money and then leverage it aggressively become wealthy. Real enough, but built on a foundation of relationships rather than rigor. The rumors about Isabella were plentiful and largely correct. She had never been seen at a company social event voluntarily. She had restructured 3 executive teams in 5 years and had not apologized for any of it. She kept no photographs on her desk, no personal effects of any kind, nothing that would suggest the existence of a life outside the precise, controlled empire she administered. She had, on one occasion, terminated a vice president in the middle of his own birthday lunch because the quarterly projections he had submitted contained a fabricated data point. In 10 years of running the Hayes Group, she had made dozens of decisions that affected hundreds of lives in ways that never crossed her desk again. That was the nature of work at the scale she operated. You moved on data and logic and long-term return, and you trusted that the aggregate was sound, even when individual outcomes were not clean. But there was a version of Isabella Hayes that no one in that building would see tonight. A version that had once trusted someone completely, a partner, a colleague, a man who had said all the right things in the right order and had watched him sign documents with another firm the morning after telling her the company's future was theirs together. She had not loved many people. She had trusted fewer. The intersection of those 2 categories had ultimately produced nothing but damage. She had not loved many people, and the ones she had loved had taught her that love, for a woman in her position, was a vulnerability that others would eventually try to monetize. Trust was a resource to be allocated sparingly, and she had spent most of hers in a single transaction that had left the account permanently overdrawn. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server without looking at him. She drank it faster than she meant to. Victor Langford had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon. He was not sloppy, not yet, but there was a looseness to his movements that his tailored suit could not entirely conceal, and a brightness in his eyes that had less to do with good humor than with the particular recklessness of a man who has convinced himself he has nothing left to lose tonight. The memo had arrived that afternoon. Hayes Group was moving forward with Caldwell Ventures exclusively. No further partnership discussions were being pursued at this time. He had read it twice. Then he had poured himself a drink. Victor was 50 years old and had been told his whole life that money was the same thing as leverage, and leverage was the same thing as power. He had won frequently. He had won ugly sometimes, but he had won. And the fact that one woman, composed, cold, 34 years old, kept refusing to be impressed by him, had lodged itself somewhere behind his sternum, like a splinter he could not reach. By the time the reception was in full swing, he had positioned himself near the center of the ballroom, with a circle of investors who laughed at his jokes. He watched Isabella move through the room, watched how she angled herself away from conversation, how she signed documents at a side table, with the focused detachment of someone who had already moved on from this room in her mind. He felt it then, that sharp, juvenile impulse to make her react, to get something from her, even if it was only attention. He raised his glass. "You know what?" he said, loud enough to carry. $1 million to anyone who walks over there and kisses Isabella Hayes. Right now, in front of everyone. The laughter came immediately, nervous and genuine at once. The kind a crowd produces when it cannot quite determine whether something is a joke or a dare. A few people glanced toward Isabella. A few glanced away just as quickly. Nobody moved. The room understood something that Victor was too drunk and too proud to acknowledge, that whatever he was offering, it was not worth what would come after. Isabella Hayes did not retaliate loudly. She retaliated permanently. Careers had been quietly rerouted by a single phone call from her office. No one in that room was so desperate for $1 million that they would step into that particular fire. Isabella did not look up from her champagne glass. Her face gave nothing away, but something in the set of her jaw, an almost imperceptible stillness that came over her shoulders, told anyone watching carefully that she had heard every word. The laughter continued, and no one moved. Victor scanned the crowd, looking for takers the way a man surveys a table after placing a bet, already anticipating the satisfaction of the outcome regardless of which direction it went. The dare hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could see but no one wanted to acknowledge had already started burning. And on the far side of the ballroom, a server in a cheap polyester uniform was kneeling on the marble floor, picking up broken glass, unaware that the next 5 minutes of his life were about to change the trajectory of everything that followed. It was the kind of mistake anyone could make on a crowded floor. A guest turned without looking, his elbow catching the edge of Daniel's tray, and 3 glasses of red wine went over, one landing on the marble floor in a bright red splash, 2 more catching the edge of a white tablecloth before gravity finished the job. The sound was sharp and immediate. The crack of crystal, the collective intake of breath from nearby guests, the way a room's attention pivots toward embarrassment, like a compass needle toward north. Daniel was already crouching, reaching for the broken stem, when the banquet manager appeared at his side. Gerald Whitmore was a man who had built a career out of managing other people's discomfort, and he managed it now with the particular cruelty of someone who has an audience and knows it. "Carter," he said without lowering his voice, "this is the 3rd incident this week." "It was one incident," Daniel said without looking up. He kept his voice level. "I don't care what you call it. You're costing this hotel more in glassware than you're earning in wages." A few guests nearby were watching now, not staring, but watching in that practiced way that wealthy people watch unpleasant scenes, enough attention to enjoy the texture of it, not so much that they would have to feel involved. "I'll pay for the glasses," Daniel said. "Yes," Gerald said. "You will." He straightened his jacket. "Clean this up and stay away from the center floor for the rest of the evening. Kitchen runs only." He walked away. Daniel stayed crouching, gathering glass fragments with a cloth napkin, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the floor. That was when he heard it. A man at the nearest table, mid-50s, pink from wine and laughter, said to his companion just loud enough for the words to land, "Even the black one breaking glasses won't go near her." He nodded toward Isabella across the room, and then his eyes fell on Daniel. Can't blame him. Some things aren't for people like him at any price. The table laughed. The words carried 2 meanings, one about Isabella and one about race, and everyone within earshot understood both without needing either explained. It was not the first time Daniel had heard language shaped that way, molded carefully enough to maintain deniability while carrying the full weight of its intention. In boardrooms, it came as culture fit. In interviews, it came as not quite the right match. At gala events, it came as people like him said with a smile and a glass of wine, as though the cruelty were a seasoning rather than the main course. Daniel did not look up, but something shifted in him quietly, like a gear finding its notch. He thought of the folded paper in his pocket, the specialist's name, the scheduled appointment, the number that was both reasonable and completely out of reach. He thought of the way his daughter had asked him that morning in the small, serious voice of a child who has learned to ask carefully, "Dad, is everything going to be okay?" He had told her yes. He stood up. He set the cloth with the broken glass on the edge of the tray. He looked across the ballroom to where Isabella Hayes stood alone with her champagne, perfectly still, watching no one. One act, one decision, and then he could go home. The tray made a small sound when he set it down on a nearby side table, precisely placed. Nothing dramatic about it. Daniel removed his bow tie, folded it once, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He ran a hand through his hair. He straightened his jacket, though it did not need straightening. Then he turned and walked toward Isabella Hayes. The ballroom had never felt larger. The ballroom was large. The walk took time. He became aware of it first, as a ripple, a guest, noticing, nudging another. The slow rotation of attention spreading outward from Victor's table, where someone had spotted the server moving with purpose and pointed. Victor himself turned, and his face broke into something between disbelief and delight. He raised his glass as if offering a toast to the entertainment. The crowd watched. They did not intervene. In another context, they might have been kind, but this was an investment gala, and the air had been salted with Victor's challenge for 20 minutes now. And human nature, given the right conditions and enough champagne, will almost always choose spectacle over mercy. There was another layer in the crowd's attention, the faint surprise when they registered that the man walking was black. Some faces tightened, not at the action itself, but at who was performing it. The ease in their laughter carried an additional undertone, the kind of comfort that comes from viewing someone as a safer kind of joke. Daniel did not look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on Isabella. She saw him coming. Of course she did. She had probably seen him the moment he set the tray down, because Isabella Hayes saw everything and processed it before most people had finished blinking. Her eyes tracked him without expression. She did not step back. She did not raise a hand. She simply watched him approach with the flat, measuring patience of someone who has learned to reserve judgment until all the information is in. There was something in the way he walked, unhurried but certain, that did not match the uniform, that did not match anything about the scene the crowd had expected to witness. He stopped in front of her, up close. He noticed things he had not expected. The slight crease between her brows, not anger, but concentration. The expression of someone working through something in real time. The champagne glass held just a fraction too tightly. The shallow, controlled breathing of someone who had trained themselves not to show what was happening inside. He leaned in slightly and spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm not doing this for him." She did not answer, but something in her face shifted so briefly it was almost deniable, the way a light flickers before it steadies. He kissed her. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was not theatrical. It was not aggressive. It was the kind of kiss that carries weight, not because of its force, but because of its intention. Careful, present, fully deliberate. His hand did not touch her. He made no performance of it. He simply kissed her gently, as though she were worth that particular gentleness. And then he straightened and stepped back. For 2 full seconds, the ballroom was completely silent. Not the polite, expectant silence of a room waiting for a speech, but the stunned silence of 500 people, recalculating something they thought they already understood. Isabella Hayes had not pushed him away. She stood with her champagne glass still in one hand, and she looked at Daniel Carter with an expression that was not the cold neutrality she had worn all evening. For one strange and unguarded moment, she looked like someone who had not been treated gently in a very long time, and had not realized until just now how much she had missed it. Victor's laughter broke the silence first. Then the crowd followed, some nervous, some genuinely amused, the sound rising up like a tide coming back in. Daniel stood his ground. He looked at no one but her. Victor set his glass down with a satisfied click. "Oh, relax everyone," he said, spreading his hands wide, grinning at the room like a man who had just delivered the punchline of a long joke. "I was kidding. I'm not paying anyone anything." He glanced at Daniel with an expression that settled somewhere between pity and contempt. "Did you really think I meant it? $1 million? For that?" He laughed again. And then he added, "Just loud enough for the nearest tables to catch. At least it provided some entertainment. That's about all people like him can offer, isn't it?" The phrase carried 2 meanings, and everyone in the room understood both. Daniel said nothing. He had expected this. Somewhere in the walk across that floor, he had understood that the money might not be real, that this had never been about money for Victor, that it had been theater from the start, a way to humiliate Isabella by proxy, to make her watch while someone tried, and then watch while that someone was made ridiculous. But for Daniel, the humiliation cut deeper than the crowd could see. Victor had not merely turned him into a joke. He had turned him into the kind of joke that a black man in a service uniform was always expected to be: the entertainment, the spectacle, the body that moves for the amusement of rooms. it will never belong to. The crowd's laughter rose and fell. Someone at a nearby table shook their head, with a particular expression reserved for people who have done something embarrassing in public. Daniel felt it, the heat of it, the specific weight of being made into a scene at someone else's party. He looked at the floor. He breathed. He thought of Lily, asleep at the babysitter's apartment 3 miles from here. And he reminded himself that the opinion of this room had never been the point. Then he heard it. Marcus. Isabella's voice was not loud, but it had a quality that cut through noise the way a clean line cuts through clutter. Precise, unhurried, impossible to misidentify as anything other than an instruction. Her assistant appeared at her side within seconds. Transfer $1 million from my discretionary account to this man. She did not look at Victor when she said it. She looked only at Daniel. Do it now, tonight. The silence that followed had mass. It settled on the room like something physical, the collective processing of something no one had predicted. Victor's smile had not entirely left his face, but it had curdled at the edges. He started to say something, some version of it being a joke, but Isabella had already looked away from him. She was watching Daniel. Daniel stood still for a moment. The notification came through on his phone. He felt the vibration in his pocket, and he knew without looking what it was, and his chest tightened with something he did not have a name for in that moment. He looked up at her. He did not bow. He did not thank her with the gratitude that shrinks a man. He just looked at her steadily, the way you look at someone when you are trying to see them clearly. And then he said, quietly enough that the room had to strain to catch it, "You're not cold, you're just lonely." He picked up his tray and walked toward the service corridor. The room watched him go in a silence that was different from the one that had followed the kiss. Heavier, more confused, the silence of people who had come to an evening expecting entertainment and had instead been made to witness something they did not entirely understand. He did not look back. Marcus Webb had been Isabella's executive assistant for 4 years, which meant he had developed a very precise sensitivity to the difference between things she said that required action and things she said that required silence. The instruction she gave him in the car on the way home, find out who he is, all of it, fell clearly in the first category. By 9 the following morning, he had a file. Daniel Joseph Carter, 38 years old, single father, 1 dependent, Lily Ann Carter, age 7. Current employment, freelance event staff through Meridian Catering Services. Current residence, a 2-bedroom apartment in the Edgemont district, a neighborhood politely described by real estate listings as up and coming, and more accurately described by the people who lived there as affordable. Marcus turned the page. Prior employment history, Bridgepoint Systems, lead systems engineer, infrastructure division, primary architect on 3 federal contract projects, one of which had involved navigation infrastructure for low-orbit commercial satellites, the kind of work that required security clearances, and the kind of brain that processed layered logical systems, the way other people processed conversation. He had been, by every measurable standard, exceptional. The kind of engineer whose departure from any team was felt for months, whose methodologies became the standard that outlived his tenure. Marcus paused on the next page. Bridgepoint Systems, acquired by the Hayes Group, fiscal year 3 years prior. The acquisition had been a portfolio play. The firm's client list and existing government contracts were valuable. The division overhead was not. The restructuring had proceeded according to standard protocol. 43 positions eliminated. Asset integration complete by the second quarter. He set the file on Isabella's desk without a word. She read it standing up, which was how she read things she did not want to sit with. The name, the company, the timeline. She knew the Bridgepoint acquisition. She had approved it, not personally reviewed each line item of the restructuring, but approved the strategy, signed the documentation, accepted the projections. She had been thorough. She had done what made sense for the portfolio. She had also, without intending it, dismantled the career of a man who had spent the better part of a decade building something real. In 10 years of running the Hayes Group, she had made dozens of decisions that affected dozens of lives in ways that never crossed her desk again. That was the nature of work at the scale she operated. You could not hold every consequence. You moved on data and logic and long-term return, and you trusted that the aggregate was sound even when individual outcomes were not clean. But this one was different now. This one had a face, a tray, a bow tie folded into a pocket, a daughter, and 4 words said quietly in a crowded ballroom that she had not been able to stop hearing since the moment she had watched him walk away. But the file showed something else. The employment pattern after Bridgepoint, dozens of applications, interviews that advanced to final rounds and then went silent. A black engineer with an exceptional track record pushed out not only by corporate acquisition, but by a system in which the color of your skin determined whether you landed on a net or fell through the floor. No one documented it that way. The pattern spoke for itself. She closed the file. She placed both hands flat on the surface of her desk, the way a person steadies themselves when the floor has shifted beneath them. She stared at the window for a long time. "You're just lonely." The words found her again, and this time she did not push them away. The Edgemont district in late November had a particular quality. The light thin and gray, the streets narrow, the buildings worn in the way of neighborhoods that had never quite decided what they wanted to become. Isabella's town car was conspicuously out of place on the block where Daniel Carter lived, and she had told the driver to park half a street away for reasons she did not entirely articulate to herself. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going up. She had not called ahead. She had told herself this was practical, that calling would give him the opportunity to refuse, and she needed to see him in person for reasons that, if pressed, she would have described as professional. A man with his credentials and specific expertise might represent genuine value to the Hayes Group. There were structural engineering problems in the current system integration project that her team was rotating through without resolution. It was logical. She rang the buzzer. The door was answered not by Daniel, but by Lily, 7 years old, wearing mismatched socks and the confident expression of someone who has answered her own door before and found it consistently manageable. She studied Isabella with the frank, unself-conscious appraisal that children reserve for people they have not learned to be polite to yet. "Are you from the school?" "No," Isabella said. "Are you a doctor?" "No." Lily considered this. "You have a fancy coat." "I do," Isabella agreed. Daniel appeared from behind Lily, drying his hands on a dish towel, barefoot on the hardwood floor. And when he saw Isabella, his face did something brief and complicated before settling into something carefully neutral. "Lily," he said, "go finish your drawing." Lily looked between them with the interest of someone who suspects they are being excluded from something important. She withdrew slowly, without enthusiasm. Daniel did not invite Isabella in immediately. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with the kind of patience that is not quite patience, the kind that is really weariness wearing a calm face. The apartment behind him was small and lived in, the kind of space that tells you everything about a person's priorities without them having to say a word. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, a pair of small rain boots by the door, a stack of library books on the hall table. Everything in it was chosen for function or for love, and nothing was chosen for impression. "I know about Bridgepoint," Isabella said. She had decided on the drive over that she would not lead with this. She said it anyway. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not the thing she had been braced for. Something more contained and more tired. The face of a man who had learned that some wounds heal better if you stop explaining them to people who were never going to understand. "So do I," he said. From inside the apartment came the sound of Lily humming to herself, the light, tuneless hum of a child absorbed in something, indifferent to the complicated world of adults at the doorway. "I'm not here about that," Isabella said. "Then why are you here?" She found, standing on that worn doorstep with the November air cold against the back of her neck, that the logical answer, the professional framing she had rehearsed in the car, felt deeply inadequate. She did not answer immediately. Daniel watched her, and in the silence, something changed almost imperceptibly, the way barometric pressure changes before weather, something you feel in your chest before you have a name for it. "Daddy," Lily called from inside. "Does your friend want some orange juice?" Isabella looked past him into the warm, cluttered interior of the apartment, and for reasons she could not explain, something tightened in her throat. "Sure," she said. Daniel stepped back and let her in. The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Isabella had stood in Daniel Carter's doorway and drunk apple juice with his 7-year-old daughter at a kitchen table covered in crayon drawings. Marcus's voice, when he reached her, carried the specific velocity of controlled panic. "The Caldwell integration system has crashed. The data migration pipeline failed during the overnight run. We have 40% of the financial data in an inconsistent state, and the contract milestone review is in 18 hours. Isabella was already pulling her coat off the back of her chair. "Get the technical team on a call. They've been on it for 3 hours. They cannot find the root failure. If we don't resolve this before the review, Caldwell walks. The $100 million is gone, and the breach of contract clause." "I know the clause," she said. She paused. "Get me the system architecture report." She read it in 6 minutes. It was a layered failure. Not a single point of collapse, but a cascade. The kind that happens when a system has been patched incrementally by different engineers who never had full visibility into each other's work. It was, she recognized, almost precisely the type of structural failure that Bridgepoint Systems had specialized in diagnosing. That had been their value to the portfolio, not just their contracts, but their methodology. She stood at her office window for 30 seconds. Then she called Daniel. He answered on the 4th ring, and she could hear faintly in the background the sound of a school morning. Lily asking about her lunch, a door closing, the ordinary texture of a life that had nothing to do with corporate system failures. "I need your help," Isabella said. She did not preface it. "I know I have no right to ask. I know what my company did to yours. But I have 18 hours, a critical system failure that my entire technical team cannot resolve. And I believe you can." There was a silence. "Send me the system logs," he said. He arrived at the Hayes Group offices at 1 in the afternoon, wearing a jacket that was slightly too casual for the building and carrying a coffee from the place on the corner of his street. He walked through the glass lobby without pausing to look around. A few heads turned on the engineering floor, the quick assessments people make when someone who does not match their expectation of what belongs in a room walks into it. He sat down at the workstation Isabella had cleared for him without ceremony. For the first 6 hours, he said almost nothing. He moved through the system architecture with the practiced efficiency of someone reading a language everyone else in the room had only partially learned. He flagged issues, traced error states back through 12 levels of dependency, documented what he found in a running log that the lead engineer, a woman with a doctorate and a decade of industry experience, read over his shoulder with an expression of increasing, reluctant respect. But when she stepped into the hallway, Daniel heard her say quietly to a colleague, "I still don't understand why she called a server instead of hiring a proper firm." The colleague responded, "Maybe she wanted to save money. At least this one's cheaper." They laughed softly, and Daniel pretended not to hear. At 7:43 in the evening, Daniel sat back and said, "Run the patch." The screen held its breath for 11 seconds. The system stabilized. The room, which had been operating on adrenaline and cold coffee for the better part of a day, went very quiet. One of the senior engineers said, not quite under his breath, he was a waiter. Isabella stood at the back of the room. She watched Daniel roll down his sleeves and reach for his coffee. She watched the steadiness of him, unhurried, self-contained, asking for nothing, and she felt something she had not expected. Not gratitude, or not only gratitude, something more specific, the particular feeling of being in the presence of someone who is exactly what they appear to be. It was, she realized, very rare. He was about to leave, jacket on, bag over his shoulder, the quiet efficiency of a man who completes a task and moves on, when Isabella stopped him in the corridor outside the engineering suite. "Why did you do it?" she asked. He turned. "The system repair?" "No." She paused. "The other thing." At the gala, the corridor was empty. Here, it was quiet. "You already know why. I want to hear you say it." He considered that. Then he said, Because you were the loneliest person in that room, and no one was going to say it to you. They were all afraid of what you might do with the information." He paused. "I didn't have much left to lose. And then," he added, more quietly, "and because I know what it's like to walk into a room where everyone has already decided what you are before you open your mouth, I built that," she said quietly. "Not Victor's performance, but the distance, the reputation. I constructed it deliberately, after I trusted someone, and it cost me everything I had spent 5 years building. I decided the safest version of myself was the one no one could reach." "I know," Daniel said, "not the details, but the shape of it. I recognized it. After Bridgepoint went under, I spent about 6 months trying to figure out if being angry was going to help anything. It didn't, but I understand the architecture. You built walls the same way I was building them, just in different directions. For me, there was an additional layer. I had to decide how much of what happened was because of who I am, and how much was because of what I look like. That uncertainty corrodes in its own way." She was quiet. What she had expected was resentment. The clean, justifiable resentment of a man whose career had been absorbed and discarded by her company's growth strategy. But he was not angry at her. He was just looking at her, clear-eyed and unhurried, with the same steadiness she had first seen in the ballroom. "You went to all that trouble to prove no one would come near you," he said, "and then someone did, and you paid them for it, instead of pretending it didn't happen." He almost smiled. "That tells me more about you than the cold routine does." She felt, suddenly and inconveniently, like something very heavy had been moved from a place she had not realized it was resting. "I owe you more than money," she said. "You don't owe me anything," Daniel said. "We're even." He said it without anger. He said it like a man who had done the accounting and closed the ledger cleanly. Victor Langford received the notice 48 hours later. Isabella made 3 phone calls and said what she knew, clearly and without embellishment. Within a week, Victor had resigned from 2 institutional boards. His name was quietly removed from upcoming deals. He was not destroyed. He was reduced. She offered Daniel a senior position, vice president of systems integrity. He turned it down over coffee. "I'm starting something with 2 engineers I used to work with, diagnostic consulting for mid-market infrastructure systems." "I know," Isabella said. "It's what Bridgepoint was built to do." She looked at her coffee cup. The Hayes Group could be a client. Something almost like humor moved between them, tentative and unannounced. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything that had preceded them. Isabella cleared 2 recurring slots in her weekly schedule and used them to notice things, to sit once in a coffee shop for 45 minutes without checking her phone. She was not transformed. She was beginning. And Daniel Carter, who had started his consultancy out of his apartment with a refurbished laptop, and 2 people who believed in the work, had a signed contract with a major capital group before the end of the month. He told Lily that night, and she asked if it meant he could buy the good cereal again. He said yes. She said, "Then it's a good day, Daddy." It was. 3 months later, at the edge of an ordinary evening, no cameras, no contracts, no audience, Isabella sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table and asked, quietly, as though the answer only mattered a little, "If it hadn't been for the money, would you still have kissed me?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. He did not answer.